Hello, back again to discuss the third wave movement. Now, at the end of the last video, I know I was pretty adamant about false prophets. I do want to say a few more words about that before I move on to the history of the latter rain movement, or the history of the latter rain movement is true because that's part of where third wave comes from. But I do want to say that I am not advocating that a false prophet cannot be forgiven or no longer is saved or anything like that. I just want to make it clear that I don't have to listen to them anymore. And if they are choosing to prophesy without listening to God, then how am I supposed to know, or any other believer for that matter, whether or not this prophecy is from God or not? So once and done is my philosophy. I can forgive them and I can count them as a brother in Christ. I'm just not going to listen to what they have to say. And I just wanted to leave that at that. Well, in our previous video, we looked at the beginnings of the third wave movement, and we traced it back to the vineyard churches under John Wimber in the 1980s. But the way that the third wave began to emerge and the streams that came along with it really go back further than that. They go all the way back, at least in my opinion, to the very beginning of the post-World War II revivals back in the late 1940s. Now, in the late 1940s, a lot of things were happening all at once. At the end of World War II, you had the evangelical movement beginning to make its way out of fundamentalism. Those who are Pentecostals and charismatics will know that that was the beginning of the great healing revivals with people like Oral Roberts and A.A. Allen, Jack Coe, T.L. Osborne, and others. But there was also another movement that began about this time, and it began in 1948 in Canada, North Battleford, Saskatchewan, to be exact, at the Sharon Bible College. And it was called the New Order of the Latter Rain. Now, the Latter Rain movement was a pretty extreme, even for Pentecostal and charismatics. It actually wound up being condemned as heretical by mainstream Pentecostals. The main reason that it was condemned is because it rejected the dispensational idea of a pre-trib rapture. Now, if you're not familiar with that language, the Pentecostal movement, due to its being birthed at least partly out of the Bible college or the Bible conference movement, held to a view of the end times that said that the world is getting worse and worse, and that God would come, or Jesus would come back and rapture his saints out of the world before the great end of time. And that has been pretty much standard Pentecostal view of the end times since the beginning of Pentecostalism. This new order of the latter rain changed all that. They said instead of the world getting worse and worse and Jesus would have to come back to fix it, they believed that they would slowly begin to take over the world and that they would finally accomplish their goal, taking it over completely, and then Jesus comes back to reign. Now, whether he comes back physically to reign or whether he reigns through them, that depends on the view. But it was a huge departure from Pentecostal views. The most popular book that I know of that explains this is a book by one of the early latter rain proponents named George Warnock, and the book was called The Feast of Tabernacles. I can personally remember seeing this book about 20 years ago, maybe, 15 or 20 years ago. At least it was back in my single days when I had a book budget. Nah, I'm kidding. But I tried to pick up anything that had to do with Jewish and Christian relationships and all. I saw this book at a bookstore, and I was excited, and I picked it up and began to look at it, and it seemed really strange. Had very little to do with Israel or the feasts or anything like that. It kept talking about the manifestation of the sons of God and this army of end time overcomers and all these things. So I didn't purchase the book, and I'm really pretty glad I didn't, because it was a very, very strange book. and I didn't know why at the time. I had no idea that this kind of stuff even existed, but I know why now, because it was a latter rain book. And again, the order of the latter rain that began in the 1940s in Canada said that instead of a rapture of the saints and the world getting worse, it was the church's job to subdue the world with these great end time super saints. Now, this is going to make more sense next week when we talk about dominion theology, because that's exactly what this is, the idea that the church will overcome the world and conquer it and rule it, fulfilling the mandate they believe that God gave Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 1. But skipping past that, a lot of different Pentecostal charismatic strands and alliances were being formed in this period of the late 40s and into the 1950s. One of them, actually two of them, was an association with the post-World War II healing evangelist William Branham. It is said that the folks in Canada got their inspiration from attending one of Branham's meetings. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I read it, not sure it's true, doesn't matter. But Branham was an interesting character. He believed that he was the angel of the book of Revelation, that he was the one that was able to interpret the seals, and he had some very strange beliefs, denied the Trinity, and one of his associates was a man by the name of Paul Kane. And Paul Kane was one of Branham's associates in the 1950s, and he sort of disappears from the public eye until the 1980s. And he resurfaces again in this vineyard-based signs and wonders movement. But he surfaces in Kansas City at the vineyard, at the Kansas City Metro Vineyard. This church was pastored by a man named Mike Bickle, and it attracted many people from the latter rain / third wave movement, and was a serious place where a lot of these minds got together. People like Paul Kane, John Paul Jackson, Bob Jones, not the fundamentalist Bob Jones. Excuse me. When I sneeze, the whole computer shakes. I'm sorry about that. Forgive me. Now you know these videos are real, because sometimes you just have to sneeze. But anyway, all of these prophets were associated with this Kansas City Metro Vineyard Fellowship. And that's where a lot of the prophetic gifts were being exercised that I talked about in the previous video. These guys were wrong a lot, and they admitted to being wrong a lot, but people still believed them. They spoke in the name of the Lord wrongly, and they still believed them. But Cain was an older man, while the rest were fairly younger in the 1980s. And so what we have is the link back to the latter rain Branham period of the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And now this resurfaces in the mid-1980s in Kansas City at the Metro Vineyard Fellowship there. Now, a couple other interesting pieces of historical note of the third wave movement. One was the Brownsville revival in Pensacola, Florida, and this occurred back in the 1990s. And also there was the Toronto blessing, which occurred in the 1990s as well at the Airport Vineyard in Toronto, Canada. These were characterized by really strange manifestations of signs and wonders. I knew people who had visited Pensacola personally and came back with weird signs and wonders. Not the kind of signs and wonders that really glorify God, but just weird things. And I don't know. There's been a lot written about them. You can research it if you're interested, but there's some strange things going on. Another name associated with the Kansas City Vineyard is Rick Joyner, who now owns most of what Jim Baker once owned in Fort Mill, South Carolina. They are part of the latter rain slash third wave slash dominionist teachings. One more thing historically that I want you to be aware of is that C. Peter Wagner, remember him? He was the missiologist who has kind of become the leader of this apostolic prophetic movement, has organized something called the International Coalition of Apostles, or the ICA. It is the group that kind of oversees and keeps tabs on all of these super apostles. They're located in Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs seems to be the new mecca of the apostles and prophets movement, sort of like what Tulsa, Oklahoma was to the Word Faith movement a few years ago. One of the super apostles was, his name escapes me now. He was elected president of the National Association of Evangelicals, but he was disgraced due to a homosexual affair. I can't remember his name. I hate that. I'll think of it later, but then it'll be too late to put it in the video. But I'm not picking at him because of that, but some of these folks are mainstream, and they've run into mainstream. Others remain on the somewhat strange fringe of Christianity and even in Pentecostalism. The Pentecostals and even the mainstream charismatics aren't all that crazy about the latter rain apostles and prophets. But they are a loud voice among charismatic Christianity. They get plenty of airtime on Christian television, like Trinity Broadcasting Network and others. So if you frequent those outlets, you've probably heard of a lot of the apostle and prophet types. And then there's always websites like the Elijah List. I find that a very, very interesting website, to say the least. It's a place where you can go and see the latest on what's been prophesied and by whom. So there's a lot going on with it. It's still too early to judge a lot of it historically. You know, when Peter Wagner dies, it may fall apart. It may not. I don't know. But they sure have a long way to go to begin policing themselves in an appropriate manner, because they really do allow for some strange birds in their sanctuary. Anyway, that's all for the history, and that's all for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we will come back next time as we look at Reconstructionism and Dominionism. So have a good day. Bye.